In the third introduction video, we went over Plato's Euthyphro argument concerning whether morality depends on God. In the fourth introduction video, I went over the basics of logic. In this video, I'm going to combine these two and present the Euthyphro argument in a basic argument form. The purpose of this video is to further illustrate the practice of thinking philosophically about matters in ethics. Recall from the third video, Euthyphro's answer to the question of what justice is went something like, "What is just is that which is approved of by God." Against this, the character Socrates in Plato's book argued that this isn't helpful. It could be taken in one of two ways. One way of taking it is to say that God's approval or disapproval is what makes something good or bad. But it clearly can't be the case that the badness of torturing a child depends on God's disapproval. It's bad whether God disapproves of it or not. It's absurd to believe that God's approval could make the torturing of children morally good. This supports the option that says that torturing children is something a good God could never approve of. But then this leaves us with another question. What makes something the type of thing that a good God could never approve of? Until we answer this question, we haven't actually answered the question of what makes some things right and others wrong. Here I present what's known as the Euthyphro dilemma in argument form. I know it looks like a big confusing mess, but hold on. What I want to do is break it down into parts, look at the parts, and then put it back together again. And when we're done, I hope that instead of seeing a big mess, you can understand more of what philosophical reasoning is like. The Euthyphro dilemma is an argument made up of 4 propositions. Remember, a proposition is a sentence capable of being true or false. Today is Tuesday is a proposition. It could be true, it could be false. Take a look at these 4 propositions. Some of these propositions could be true, others could be false. What will matter is how they fit together. Now let's identify these propositions in the original argument. This is the same argument we looked at before. I know, now it looks even worse, but it helps us to see the different parts and how they fit together. What I've done here is color-coded each of the 4 propositions. Then on the right, I presented the same argument using letters to stand in for each of those propositions. Now let's start to look at the parts and how they fit together. The first proposition says, A is right because God approves of A. It appears 3 times in the argument, and it's represented by the letter P. This proposition will be shown to be false. I use green for the second proposition, the proposition that says God approves of A because it's right. I also use the letter Q. This proposition will be shown to be true, at least under the assumptions we're using in this discussion. One of those assumptions is that there's a God. We'll also assume that this God is all-knowing and that this God is perfectly good. God could never approve of something that's evil or wrong. This brownish-orange color is being used to identify the proposition the torture of a child would be right if it were approved of by God. It'll also be abbreviated as the letter R. And finally, this yellow color and the letter S are used for the proposition the rightness of A does not depend on God's approval. This argument will aim to show that this proposition is true. Now let's go through the argument one step at a time. Euthyphro said that what is just is what is approved of by God. We're accepting this as true, but what does it mean? Socrates gives 2 possible interpretations. The first interpretation, something is right or good because God approves of it. This is the proposition colored blue and assigned the letter P. The second interpretation is God approves of something because God sees that it is right or good. This is the proposition colored green and assigned to the letter Q. We're going to consider each of these interpretations one at a time. We'll start with the option that says that something is right because God approves of it. The claim that something is right because God approves of it means that for anything we can think of, Its being right or wrong depends on God's approval or disapproval. So let's take a test case. The act of torturing a young child just for the pleasure of hearing the child scream in terror and pain. I'm sorry for the example, but I need an example that most clearly represents the point, and a milder example might hide the relevant point. If the badness of this is dependent on God's disapproval, then what would happen if God didn't disapprove? What would happen if instead God approved of torturing a young child just for the pure pleasure of doing so? Under this interpretation, God's approval would make this a good thing. But this is absurd. Nothing, not even God, can make it the case that torturing a young child for the pleasure of hearing the child scream in pain and terror is good. This means that we can object to the interpretation that says that the badness of torturing a child depends on God's disapproval. That's just not true. If we reject the first interpretation, then, by means of the process of elimination, we're left with the second interpretation. The interpretation says that God approves of something because it is right or good, or more to the point, God knows that torturing children is a horrible thing to do, and that is why God disapproves of it. So let's look more closely at what this second interpretation implies. On the second interpretation, God considers the act of torturing a child for the pleasure of hearing the child scream and knows that it's a horrible thing to do. Its badness is why God disapproves of it, and also why God prohibits us from doing it. But this means that God's disapproval is not what makes some things wrong. Instead, it's the wrongness of some things, like torturing a child, that makes them the kinds of things that a good God could never approve of. Its wrongness does not depend on God's disapproval. Instead, God's disapproval depends on its wrongness. This leads us to the following conclusion. The rightness or wrongness of something does not depend on God's approval or disapproval. Instead, God's approval or disapproval depends on its rightness or wrongness. Our next question is, what is it that makes some things deserving of God's approval and other things deserving of God's disapproval? That's a very interesting question. What we have here is an argument. We have a set of 7 propositions, where the truth of the first 6 propositions is said to prove that the 7th proposition, the conclusion, is true. Is this a sound argument? We have to ask, are each of these 6 premises true? Is there any reason to believe that any one of these premises is false? If the premises are true, then is the argument form valid? Is it possible for the premises to be true and for the conclusion to be false? If the argument form is valid and the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. This is generally what philosophers struggle to do when they approach questions in ethics. The aim is to come up with arguments that show that one's beliefs are true. It's not always easy. In fact, it can be quite difficult. In this series, we're going to be trying to apply this philosophical method to a number of questions in ethics.